Okay, great. I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for being here tonight for our for tonight's alternate currents panel discussion, Who Needs Who the Most, Artists and Cultural Institutions, with our panelists, Jonathan Gonzalez, glyneisha, and Lillian Snortland. I want to give a special shout out to the Pate Family Foundation and a big thank you to the Nebraska Arts Council and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment, whose support makes programs like these possible. My name's Peter. I work here at Amplify Arts. For anybody who's new to Amplify, our mission is to support unity, progress, and innovation in the cultural sector. And Alternate Currents is a program that helps us do that by contextualizing national and international topics in the arts with responses from people who are working at the ground level. The program does that in a few different ways. First, we've got the Alternate Currents blog, which is an online resource. Secondly, we have this bi-monthly discussion series that we're all participating in tonight. And thirdly, we have a working group of 10 arts and culture workers who collectively develop project-based work that helps shape the program and helps move it forward. So Lily, who's on the panel this evening, is a member of our 2021 Alternate Currents Working Group. This discussion is also part of a year-long investigation of the future of cultural institutions and how it can be shaped by equity and transparency and accountability. Our panelists are going to be in conversation with each other for about an hour. And they would like to invite you all to consider yourselves active participants in this discussion as well, right from the get-go, right from the outset. Please feel free to enter your thoughts or your questions in the Q&A at any point during this conversation. I also want to let you know that a video and a transcript of tonight's discussion with links to additional articles and resources will be posted to the Alternate Currents blog in the next week or two. So please revisit the discussion there, leave your thoughts in the comments and help us keep these discussions going. You can find the Alternate Currents blog at our website at amplifyarts.org. So all that said, I'm really excited personally for tonight's discussion and to learn from our three incredible panelists, Jonathan Gonzalez, glyneisha, and Lillian Snortland. Lily will also be asking questions and kind of guiding tonight's discussion. So thank you all again so much for being here. And Lily, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I mean, Peter said it all. Thanks for being here. We really appreciate it. And I guess I'll just start off by introducing myself. My name is Lily. I'm currently in Baltimore, Maryland, but I lived for a while in Omaha. And I'm a writer and I work in the nonprofit arts sector right now. And so for me, this conversation is really important because I feel like I don't want to lose sight of what artists are experiencing in their relationship with the nonprofit sector as someone working there and as someone who's going to have to navigate those relationships myself. And so I'm really excited to get to speak to glyneisha and Jonathan today. And I will go ahead and pass it off to glyneisha.
Thank you, Lily. Hi, everyone. My name is glyneisha. I am coming to you tonight from native Kickapoo land, also known as Texas. I'm also born and raised in Texas. I have an extensive art career based out of Kansas City, Missouri. But I just moved back home and getting rerouted, regrounded. I'm a community organizer, co-founder of a community-based organization called Strange Fruit Films, which is a Black-led organization that centers the voices and work of Indigenous, Black, Brown, films in the Midwest through programs for youth and adults. I'm also a polydisciplinary artist and educator, and do a lot of things that are creative and intentional. I'm excited to be here with y'all tonight and with the other panelists. Thank you.
Jonathan, you're up.
Thank you. My name is Jonathan Gonzalez. My pronouns are they and them. I'm currently located on Lenape and Canarsie territories, where it's known as the Two Rivers Meet. And I speak also from the position of a member of Northeast Farmers of Color Network in the process of land back campaigns that are occurring here in New York State, but also with the Stockbridge-Muncie people moving into the Western Massachusetts region, or as it's known today. I'm an artist. Definitely, I'm an artist. I'm a choreographer. I have been a dancer and a performer. I'm also a kind of a long-term grassroots activist as someone who is a farmer, and also a cultural organizer trying to make strides that push against the kinds of policies that exist in this place where I'm born and raised, which is now known as New York City. I'm born and raised in Queens, and much of my life's work in geopolitical rights, fighting for food sovereignty, but also community gardens has been located here in this place, in this space. And a lot of my art practice is collaborative processes. So I work with a lot of people, and that's across multiple mediums, normally and mostly on topics of life affirming Black life and trying to imagine futures where we live. So we'll talk more about that. I would love to talk more about that. I feel like there's already overlap happening. So thank you for having me. I look forward to everything that happens. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, you guys. I think we should just dive into the big question, like the whole reason we're here, because I think that that will open up the door to a lot of other questions as we go along. And I think that first question would be, who does need who more, institutions or artists? And I just want to let you take your first stab at it, and then we can move on from there. Jonathan, do you mind going first?
Yeah, for sure. I'll go first. I wanted to almost read back the question, the Andrea Fraser question, because I hadn't known that, I didn't know the statement. So I also had to I really appreciated Peter offering these questions, because Andrea Fraser states in this that there is no outside to the art world, and artists cannot exist in an antagonistic relationship to the institutions of art, because artists are integral to the institutions of art. And I guess I had a question back to Andrea Fraser, which I would love to hear with glyneisha tonight, and maybe with you too, Lily, where I wanted to ask what happens when the practices and collective expressions that we're working on require conditions that cannot thrive inside of the institution, or cannot be housed or held or harnessed inside of the institution, because of all the things I think we'll try to touch on, but we would need 40 weeks to really grasp together in terms of the institution of art and the cultural centers that are even community centers, if we want to really go there too, how they reinforce forms of the state that keep us from getting to do the kinds of things that the revolution is asking us to do, and the kinds of things that are already happening. I guess that's what I'm trying to say too, that it's one, the answer is we do not need institutions, because institutions exist outside of what we call institutions, and they're collective spaces. They're the organizing space. They're the place that happens on the corner. They're the mural that honors somebody who's passed. There's so many examples of places where culture thrives and conversation happens, and nuanced ways of looking at the ways that we live happen through expression. And the institutions that we're talking about, I think tonight, which are 501c3s, if we want to be specific, they occupy a kind of engine of the state, which one of my friends, Ron Ragan, was just speaking about, which is they, talking to Sage Crump, who's out of the Emergent Strategy Ideation Institute, these institutions, perhaps we could say they valorize the kinds of investments they want to see for reasons that keep us from getting to doing the work we need to do sometimes. So, and the last thing I say, because I talked a lot, is that, and then what we do with institutions as artists, I think is harm reduction for those who work with them. And I would love to talk about harm reduction as a principle when we work with these institutions.
Yeah, one thing that I'm thinking about immediately with that quote is I think especially right now, artists and community organizers, activists, folks who are within in doing this work, like how all of us don't have this reliancy upon kind of defining ourselves in collaboration or in correspondence or in an antagonistic relationship to the institution, because it is such a separate sector of work that's kind of for us, by us, specific for our community. But I think like within, you know, doing that work, you do have to recognize like it is making space for like what is not happening at the same time. But I think that it's also important to give those spaces and these cultural care and community started spaces kind of the credit for themselves, that like they are what they are, so to speak, and they have power within themselves, and we don't always have to center or frame the conversation around how they are in correspondence to these institutional spaces that don't keep artists like me in mind.
Yeah, I think that those are both incredibly good points. And I wanted to hop on this concept of harm reduction. I think particularly as someone who has worked in a lot of different organizations over these past years, I think there is a certain amount of ethics that is always playing in the back of my mind, because working within these institutions, I can tell you, yeah, they don't always have, they don't have the whole of humanity in mind, so to speak. They have their very specific demographic in mind a lot of the time. And so I think that for me, I have been trying lately to really look more to community organizers and their sort of like their vision of abundance, where they have resources that might seem like less than an institution, but ultimately they are never thinking like we have this finite amount of resources. It is talking about an exchange across the board. And so for me, I'm like my harm reduction, so to speak, by being within the institution is me always trying to have that psychology of abundance voiced. So I don't know if that sort of can, I don't know, add a little bit of context from the other side, so to speak. But I mean, I am an artist and also I work in institutions, so.
Yeah, I wanted to respond because I was really generative. I think that's helpful. And also, Glyneisha, thank you, because you really just set I think, up the ante in terms of where we're going to. Yeah, I think, and that, like you're saying, Lily, there's also something to like, I think I get good to say tonight, like my caution is like also how much so if we say the cultural institutions are the 501c3 that tend to reproduce the things that we don't really need, like let's name those, because there are other institutions that actually are doing really important rooted work. So I don't want to make that get mixed up. If those institutions that typically reinforce gentrification by coming into a community and not creating connections with what is actually already there, and import culture and import tourism and import new people who become the owning class of that community and push out and displace people, if we're talking about those institutions, when those institutions learn from organizing spaces, collectives, artists that are pushing the conversation about how we deal with each other, we also, I think for myself as an artist who also has been brought into institutions to try to shake things up and has been kicked out for going too far or have gone too far and been asked to remain, all the pluralities of that, there's something about the extractive economy that is like so important to hold truth to, that it's like, and I would love to talk more about this like as we go, like what is the bedrock to these institutions in terms of, like someone said heart chakra when we first came in, like what is the originating intent of these kinds of models like the 501c3, which the Ford Foundation and certain foundations that, you know, reinforce the presence of these institutions also come up at a certain time period in which major revolutionary ideology is happening, and these foundations and this is stuff I'm learning from Dylan Rodriguez, who I will put in the chat, like these foundations show up and they create grants and micro grants and structures that fund the radical aesthetics, but they cut off the final call, which is structural change, you know? And I guess maybe it's like that neoliberal okey doke that I think Robin D.G. Kelley talks about a lot. That's like, you know, like we can't get too committed to reform. Like, you know, we really can't, because we'll be reforming until we die, you know, especially people of color, especially Black femmes who are always asked to reproduce this labor, you know, and with artists, especially artists of color. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and it's like, we work overtime in our death sometimes because our citations are used, you know? So I'm just like, also know that there's a boundary, I think, there in terms of what happens outside and what happens in these locations, how they should have a certain amount of honoring and presencing when they look at organizing real deeply, and know that they cannot reproduce that logic, because that work is different. Yeah.
I think something that sort of has stuck to me lately is this idea that I think like the 501c3 that, you know, we're thinking of, that has all the cultural capital in the world, all the resources, all the money, to like, a lot of their power comes from their stability. And that's because they've amassed wealth and all, you know, on the backs of smaller organizations, of individuals, of who are not who they are serving. And to me, I feel as if something that goes along with this idea of changing that psychology completely is the idea that like that stability is not inherently good, because that stability is what actually stops them from being able to dissolve if they are not serving the correct purpose. There's just like this feeling of like holding on so tight to the past because that's the only way to stay afloat and stay strong. And so I think like that's always interested me, because, you know, the individual artist is working to, you know, stay afloat in their own way, but it doesn't quite have that same like grasping. There's more fluidity, I think, to being a smaller organization who is really connected to the community, as opposed to who's latched on to this like mythical past and this cultural strength that they think that they have. So I don't know if that resonates at all.
Yes, for sure, for sure. I am thinking about, in our last Soulful Safe Space Sunday for Strange Fruit Films, we use this conversation hosted by UC Davis with Adrienne Marie Brown and Angela Davis. And one of the notes that I wrote down that I pulled up that Adrienne Marie Brown said is, are we speaking to build relationships, or are we speaking to broaden, to connect? Are we speaking to separate, isolate, or make ourselves superior? And so I feel like, to your points, Jonathan, kind of within the 501c3 and kind of distinguishing those programs or those like happenings for youth and adults, I feel like that sometimes even within kind of bringing outsiders within, there's still like this sense of superiority to the programs having to be met from these kind of standards that are from white supremacy, from the academy, from the institution, in like in the finest details, how things are set, how placemats are, how tables are met, how people are introduced, how folks are like welcomed into the space. And so I think like we need to step out of this like sense of operating from professionalism and like take accountability and recognition for like where those standards come from. And within the 501c3 work, like when it's like a person like me or my friend or my Black femme friend coming in and kind of like offering this work, letting that those walls come down, like letting yourself kind of be open to that exchange of like what these folks in the community can offer and how exactly they want to do that work.
Yeah, wow, thank you. Wow, yeah, no, that's, my brain is like firing. There's like 400 things coming to my mind right now. But I just wanted to say a story because so I could ground it in a personal experience in response to what glyneisha is saying, because I had an opportunity to be a part of exactly like glyneisha is saying, like a context in which a group of outsiders, artists, people who were organizing were brought into an institution. And I'll just give the history and be brief just to get back to the point. But Performance Space New York is an institution in New York City. It used to be called 122cc in the 70s when it started, and it's based off of, just like Lily said so well, like a nostalgia about in the 70s, which in the 70s in New York City was a really big time for experimental performance for all people of all different kinds of creeds and backgrounds, because it was a time also where there was a lot of corruption occurring in terms of housing, in terms of what was possible. So artists were present at that conversation and building community in that time. But 122cc was a group of artists who came into this abandoned public school and created a kind of collective art ecosystem as squatters. You know, legally they were squatters. And that happened in a lot of places in New York at that time. And this one example, Performance Space New York, I would say is probably one of the more white hegemonic avant-garde examples. Like I will drop a book in the chat by someone I really is a really dear person thinker, Nandini Bagchi and Charas, who are actually a Puerto Rican art action collective who did the same thing. And I would say we're very much so rooted in trying to affirm life in the community. I would say Performance Space New York's history is one that's actually reinforces kind of Western logics of art and kind of imports art from other places and not from the Lower East Side where they're located. And also because of that, Charas and their institution has been shut down by the city, and the community right now is in a fight to try to get that back as a landmark, while Performance Space still has its territory, which remains typically very locked. You can't really enter it unless you've been given invitation. But I was a part of a project that lasted a year, that a group of about 10 artists were invited to think about the programming. And also we were given a salary to be on staff and to think about what would change contractually, how artists relate with an institution. In 2020, this happened. So when COVID happened in March and all these cultural institutions closed here in New York, we had to leave pretty much. We had our card keys still, but no one could be in the building anymore safely. And a group of us as artists kind of inside of this whole cohort really, you know, we were attending the protests, we had already been organizing. We recognized that people needed a place to, you know, get water, to eat, to charge their phones because we were on the street, and also to like hide out at times because there was a curfew, which was also leading to more arrests. And so it became an opportunity to use the building, and we did. And it's, you know, just to name also comrades and people in that group and their labor, like Ripley Soprano, Sarah Snyder, Nadia Taikulska, Rudy Gerson, Lou, Danielle Brown, Angel Robertson. There's so many people. But what we had to do in response to what you're saying, Lily, I think we have to do, we have to push, we have to create situations sometimes, some of us, if it happens, and it's hard still, where we really do refuse the system altogether, you know? Like we went into the building, we created a mutual aid space that was a freedom, you know, it was called Angela's Mondays, and we did abolitionist reading circle on Mondays, and we did safety training for first aid for those of us on the street Tuesdays, and a DRS training on Wednesdays. And we did a harm reduction mobile clinic that rode around the streets and helped folks out. And we opened the theater doors and turned them into a place where Black, queer, and Indigenous people, primarily trans and femmes, were there residing who were houseless. And that could only happen for so long, because when people came back from the Hamptons and came back from being abroad and came back to work in the fall and the winter came, you know, these worlds collided. They really did collide. And I think the institution is learning a lot about how it responded, which includes people in the building calling the cops on us and et cetera, you know, like things that reinforced us leaving to the point that we had to leave. And I think that'll be in the wake of that institution. And I think that's really important, you know, what we do to make a hard break sometimes. Yeah, that was a long story, but thank you. Yeah.
Glyneisha, I don't know if you had a further response to that story. Thank you so much for sharing, Jonathan. I feel like this is a good sort of pathway to maybe asking if, well, all of us have answered, artists do not need institutions. And I think I want to sort of ask, oh, Glyneisha, do you have something you want to say?
I said, but they need us.
Yes, yes, they do. And I think that I would love to know, in your opinion, like, what do you think true artistic value is? And do you think that the way that institutions value your creativity, your art, or art in general is reflective of that? And if so, or if not, like, what's next? How do we put the pressure on to make them actually see what the value is? Or do we just leave them in the dust and somehow build some system that does actually intertwine well with the true value of art? That was a really long question. I apologize. But
For me, that question opens up this kind of definition of the institution that we made for ourselves at the beginning of this, but like includes the museum, includes the gallery, and my first response is like, hell no. But then I think about like spaces like the Luminary in St. Louis, Cam Museum, folks who are like letting artists come in and have these like conversations that don't censor selling their work, but censor like these community involved conversations, and also sometimes like really personal aspects that like don't everybody always relate to or get. And so I think that I think that some folks are doing the work and some folks are open to that exchange, which requires this kind of hands-off approach in a way. But I think that they have started that process because they are bringing in thought leaders and artists who are already doing that on the everyday. I'm thinking about like my first big solo exhibition in Kansas City. I was the first Black femme artist who was represented by this gallery. And as the like year progressed with me getting ready for my solo show, it came to a space where I was like, I need to like really center my people in this show, and ended up like turning the gallery into a Black home, placing wallpaper, furniture, objects that has this kind of matrilineal history within my family, but really censoring and turning on the face like who feels comfortable in these spaces. Because I had friends coming up to me like, you know, I don't know if I want to come to your show because I don't like that gallery. I walk in there and I don't feel welcome. I don't feel safe. So it's like, I think that it again, it comes down to the artist, you know?
Yeah, thank you. I think I felt you brought me there. I think I was feeling that at the beginning too. I'm like, I think there's a lot of different scales and ways that people are doing this. Like, I think, like we're saying, like if I could say some examples, like I recently was on a panel last week. I guess we all are doing a lot of these nowadays, but where I was watching the Harriet Tubman Collective from Pittsburgh talk about, you know, the ways that they see themselves as an institution. And, you know, the Harriet Tubman Collective is a collective of primarily Black and brown folks who are disabled, who make work that's trying to both, you know, create spaces that enable visioning around that world building. And it was, you know, the example they said, they named it simple, but, you know, revolutionary, was placing a bench outside of the Harriet Tubman Collective's primary place, their residence, their house where they operate out of as a creative space in Pittsburgh. in which people in this community that doesn't really have many benches could be able to sit on a bench, which means that they could be also in proximity to this house, which means that they could communicate together and they could build, you know. And I think sometimes it's the really simple things, you know, like I think, like you're saying, glyneisha, like Black spatial practice, like how do we make a space? Like, so I also think like when we just do, even for those of us who are making work that is coming out of our lived experience and trying to push a liberation ideology or theology, when we work inside of, for instance, institutions that do not serve us historically, let's say, we are already always making a little bit more of a fuss than we perhaps thought we were going to. And I think that also is something that needs to be perhaps honored, you know. Like I'm thinking about, for instance, Sharita Town and Lisa Bates, this is Black Spatial and Imaginary in Portland, Oregon, who made their show, or Sharita kind of brought that body of work into PICA, into Portland, Oregon, into that institution, which is located in a historically Black community that's completely been displaced by this point. And by bringing this work that's about charting the historical record of Black people who have lived in the Pacific Northwest in an institution that really is not at all serving that population, and then asking them to come back and like, come see this exhibition here, you know, like it creates, like, just by way of making that thing happen there, it makes this kind of fuss, you know, it makes noise. And it also makes a place where we can think together, you know, a Black spatial place where we could think aloud and contemplate what's happened here. Yeah.
I am curious, in terms of that last example that you shared, Jonathan, was this just a one-off exhibition, or was this something that remained after? Sorry, I was putting something in the chat, so I missed.
I think it's worth looking more deeply, and I'm sure somebody in the audience might be able to even fill in more information, but as of my knowledge, it's a series. So there's actually a few different iterations of the work.
So I think that is incredibly important to me, because I've seen in so many ways where it feels like it's just like a drop in the ocean of other exhibitions, where it makes a really like impactful deep splash, but then it's gone. And it's basically just like restarting over that placemaking every time you bring someone in every few months. And yeah, but it just doesn't feel, I don't know, it doesn't feel like long lasting enough to me.
That's such an important point, Lily, which I like admire spaces that are thinking about these like programs and positions that they can implement to like facilitate a continued translation process. So like folks that have like artists in residence, or farmers in residence, curators in residence, critics in residence, which are like most often these 1-year residency programs where those folks can really come in and engage with the community. One example is my beloved Charlotte Street Foundation, foundation in Kansas City, 5013C Foundation in Kansas City, that like really does a lot for the artists. I've worked with them a lot, but I think it was around maybe 2016, they had a curator in residence program, and this person named Lynette Miranda from Chicago came in and really just changed Kansas City on its face as far as like the conversations that we were having in our art communities. And so I think like those opportunities are important.
I also wanted to take about a minute, if that's okay with you, to let people put any questions in the chat that they might have. Just because I know that we could keep talking, but I'm hoping that we can make space for some voices out there in the virtual sphere. I don't know, guess we can just.
Another thought that I was having while y'all are thinking of questions, based on some thoughts from Jonathan's points, are kind of when the institution, when this space like opens the conversation, like how they have to realize that they made the table, if that makes sense. Because I think a lot of times, like, within these like larger cultural conversations and decolonizing and breaking down like these thoughts, like it's not always easy. And I think sometimes like those shows happen, the conversations happen, the panels happen, and the points made forces those institutions to look at themselves in the mirror, and sometimes they don't want to always do that. But I think that like when the community gets involved and has questions for the institution, it's important for the institution to make a space of forum, make a space of community, and fully engage in the conversation, because you made the table, you made the seats, and you invited us.
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna talk, and then if people in the audience do want to chime in, just please cut us off because I think we'll just keep going. But I want to just agree that I feel like what I am, and I'm still in dialogue with institutions, like I'm not like moved away from institutions, but I think the thing that proves to be most effective in the kinds of creative processes that I enjoy being part of when I'm in the process of visioning with other people, in the kind of organizing that I'm a part of, when I'm in the process of coalition building with people and across multiple perspectives, is the regular town hall format, the place in which we can, from our affinities, from our separate spaces of deep visioning, come back together and be reminded, like, what is this collective vision holding up to? What is our accountability so far? And where have we produced harm because there has been harm and we didn't show up? And how are we going to enable a hard dialogue each week to do that really important work, which I think, again, I just want to center that it's like, the institution is not one thing, because that is an institution. Like that's actually a working institution right there. Like that's an example of an emergent model that doesn't have perhaps 501c3 representation, but is a functioning ecosystem, where people can enter with all their various interests and diversities into that space and collide, which I think the institutions that we're centering right now, they're not spontaneous nor risky nor able to be, because they have so many other contractual agreements that don't permit them to hold space, for possibility, for chance. And that includes a weekly place where they can just hear from the community, because that produces a certain level of risk. And, in that way that I think white supremacy ideology works, is that it wants paternalism. It wants to own the dialogue and the narrative around itself. So it's not able to take in the kinds of critiques that would disturb the public eye of what they're doing. And I guess the last point, and then I'll stop, is that, and then these kinds of incubators where we're invited in, they always become good PR, right? Because the institution actually doesn't have to do anything once they invite the kind of representation of, what let it be, whatever other they want to be using in that time. And I feel like it's a broken record. My ancestors probably said this, like, I feel like we need to break that record. Like we need to say like what we're doing there and what we're doing over here.
Yeah, I think we could spend, the last 20 minutes of this conversation, like giving some examples and talking about the work that we do, folks who are stepping outside the institution. Because just like thinking of these stories and talking about it, like it's traumatic. The trauma comes up, like I'm thinking about how these 501c3s done treated me. And I'm just like, at the end of the day, they care about their funders. And so it's important for, if you need to step away, like take your shit back, and say like, you no longer have the power to host, represent, be in conversation, collaboration with me, because like I said earlier, they need us, we don't need them. And so it's important, for us to branch out and do the work and try to also lean on folks who are doing the work and that we can learn from. Like in starting my community-based organization, Strange Fruit Films, y'all can find that at strangefruitfilms.com. We're also on Instagram at Strange Fruit Films. I just, we have so many conversations about like when you're doing this activism work, how it's so structured around being a nonprofit or having to gain 501c3 status. And I seeked out an organization in Kansas City called Front Space, who are two Mexican women who have started their own organizations, kind of thinking about cultural artistic spaces built for themselves and built for the community. But they taught me so much about just like learning about fractured atlas and fiscal sponsors and ways that you can navigate and get sponsorship, get grants, and get loans, and how you don't have to follow this route that everybody like teaches us or prescribes us to.
We do have one question in the chat that I will take a moment to read. And the question is, you've referenced experiences with different kinds of institutions, commercial galleries, nonprofit galleries, residencies, etc. I'm curious, do you see some of these institutions or characteristics of them that serve artists better, worse? Anyone?
I guess I kind of feel like we have answered that question in many different ways, but if I could be maybe more specific, like I feel personally and in community that space and time that's not surveilled, so no one is watching the people who are using that space and time, has always been really a pleasure for a lot of people to build out and build out the things that they want to do. So if that's called a residency, sometimes that can be very helpful. If it's very hands-off, meaning that the institution's not present and asking for a lot of deliverables in terms of what happened there. I think also experiments like the one that I was a part of are really important. I think that there's the dyad between better and worse, it maybe is a thing that don't work for me, because like we're actually talking about transformational change. So like things are gonna feel bad in the moment, and like glyneisha said, and then later actually be like, oh, that was actually very important. Like I needed to have that really hard experience to understand the ways that the whole thing, the whole system, so even when it's better, is still broken. Like I guess what I'm saying is that my critique or my location as an artist is one of anti-capitalism. Like I'm an anti-capitalist, post-nationalist. I don't want the nation of America. I think this project doesn't work. And I think my work is to both find pleasure in being with my community in terms of expression and being somebody who feels in line as an artist to express. I feel a channel in that way. I honor through that way. And then simultaneously, I push in a policy-driven way to try to make space for the ways that I see that those doorways don't exist. And I, for the ways that I'm read in spaces, can access them. So, like trying to really stay present with the way that like Shirley Chisholm reminds us that our time on earth is one that we have to pay back for by producing real change. So I don't think it matters where it happens, basically, is what I'm trying to say. I think the long goal and the principled goal is to see the end to all these institutions. And in the meanwhile is to try to build out that the employment looks different, that the executive levels are stopped being white cis people, that the lower administrative level stops being primarily Black femmes and Indigenous femmes and people who have to do labor that doesn't actually sit on their application, but it becomes a part of their work, that the custodial staff is not the same kinds of undocumented people, that the institutions are no longer locked all the times, that there's more transparency when we're talking about what kinds of aesthetics we support and which ones we don't, and to name how that is continuing to make the role of the artist a capital A, rather than letting us think about how artists are really echolocated everywhere around these institutions and not being chosen. So I want to name those things no matter where I go. So it doesn't matter. And the institutional ways that we get in there, we use them. So, yeah.
My comment in response to that is exactly, period.
Let's see. It looks like we have another question that came in. A lot of this conversation is making me think about ways that institutions could become more personable, not in the way of posting social media statements, but actually working with artists on a person-to-person basis. I see it as a kind of transparency and tearing down the walls in a way. Not sure if this is a question, but I'm interested to hear if the panelists have any opinion on this. I was thinking about this connects to me with the previous question in that at first I would think, like, my heart says I do not trust galleries and I do not trust that transactional aspect. But then you find that transactional aspect in basically every other of the listed like versions of like that relationship between an artist and an institution, so to speak. So I found it interesting that one person once said to me, like, a gallery actually has some of the most vested interest and long-term like relationship with the person who they are representing. So yes, it is transactional, which is not ideal, but there is a weird aspect where at least they are invested in a way that like other forms of like institutional relationships, they just say, okay, we're going to bring you in, we're going to pay you your one-time fee, and then you're out the door, and we'll maybe post like a picture of you, like 3 months later being like, look who came through, like they've gone on and done such great stuff. So I think that, like, for me, I feel like that person-to-person aspect is what is missing, but right now it is just completely extricative, and it needs to be flipped into something that doesn't have that transactional aspect. And I'm not really sure what that would look like. Somewhere between the residency model and a gallery relationship, because residents are only there for, generally a short period of time, and then they too move on. And so in a weird way, like, I don't necessarily feel like I feel as if there is also a sense of like transiency, like that relationship isn't really as solid as it could be, but I don't know what you guys think about that.
I think kind of based on some of the points that Jonathan was making earlier, like, I'm really sitting here trying to think about where they could do better, but it just can't happen because like the institution wasn't built to be personable. It wasn't built to have a relationship with me. They don't want to be my friend. The gallerist, the residency, the institution. And so for me, like that exchange or that community, I find it elsewhere. Um and also, I sometimes, because I recognize like that relationship, I don't want to, like, I'm intentional about the relationships that I'm building, and I don't want to build relationships that are fraud and based on capitalism and based on exchange of service, temporary service. Like, we can just leave it professional, leave it at what it is, and like I'm gonna find my community and know that like where I fit in and where I find happiness and where I feel accepted is elsewhere. And so like thinking about like the main questions, like, do artists need the institutions? Do they need us? Like, I feel like as an artist who sells and makes a living off of selling my work, I have to accept that the system in which I am in contributing to like the art world capitalism, and but also make space for like what is not. And then I also want to say, girl, Lily, the galleries ain't nice either.
I don't trust any of them, but I'm like, there are bits and pieces. Like, if someone says like that is something that I'm missing in these other relationships, like that's something. I'm not pro gallery, let me be clear. But
I just want to say sometimes I feel like the issue with the gallerists is that like most gallerists are white men. And so they're always going to subscribe to the good old boys. Like I was probably, when I was represented by a gallery, I was probably like the fourth highest paid artist. But still, the gallery owner was not having no dinners with me, not taking me out to coffee, but having donuts and coffee every Sunday with the white men who weren't selling shit. Like, that's really what it is. And so, like, I think it's important to be aware of that instead of trying to fit in a system that wasn't made for you. You know, we got to think about Audre Lorde in the Master's Tools.
Something that I think, just to like continue down this road, if that's okay, I think that investment quality is a capitalist concept. So I'm going to sort of like go like build on my like the foundation that I just laid, which is like it is in a capitalist mindset. Like that totally my fault. That is what I've presented to you, is this idea that like that investment is basically replacing a true authentic relationship in capitalism. Like that's kind of the closest that you can get, is saying, well, at least someone is in my corner for their own interests financially, but that is a sort of protection and stability to have someone investing in you and in your corner. But I do agree that we need to be beyond that, and that might not be able to be found with any relationship between an institution and an artist. So I fully agree with you, glyneisha. I think that we basically have to use our imaginations and completely exit that framework as much as possible. Like it sometimes feels like asking for a miracle, but it's not if you like have faith in artists, which I think is one thing that I haven't had a chance to bring up. But part of why I am also really excited to be a part of this panel and listening to you guys is, for me, like the people with the imagination are the people with the power to actually change the world and be able to say, we should not be in this circle of capitalism in the first place, because it's all a system. And I think when you're in it, you feel as if that is as far as you could go, but that was a system that was made, and institutions play a part in a system that was made. And so you can unmake it and make a better one, I guess, is what I wanted to say.
I do think there are people who like operate in this kind of state of like easily going within and without the academy, within the institution, outside of the institution, and like use themselves, their reputation, and what they can offer to like actually build relationship with artists and actually have a friendship. I'm thinking about Larry Osai Mensah, who's a Black critic who has a magazine, has kind of like an art speak series, who shares artists on his Instagram. But it's like once you meet him, I think he does within himself and within his work try to like have this continued relationship with the artist that is not about these like one-off experiences, but like when he's going into residencies and meeting these artists, he's thinking about like in the future, how can I connect these artists with other opportunities, other programs, other things that are in reference to what they do in their work. And I think that there's people like in all of those places and institutions who are trying to really think about community and relationship building.
Yeah, I want to affirm that. Thank you. It just made me think like it would be so great if all of those people in all of their jobs and whatever they do just all went somewhere else together. We're like, okay, let's go over here and try to make something, so we could all stop being inside of our own like coffins of capitalism and try to like just like identify ourselves and go over there. But I think the contradictions, like in the way that Octavia Butler tells us, are really necessary, and we need to maintain those contradictions as we start to vision towards what's next. And we are at a very transformational moment. And also it's about harnessing and naming that and not being able to be given the same kinds of reprimands by way of the managers and by way of the people who are executives about the unrealistic nature of choosing these other things, which are really about choosing affirming life for people who are normally not affirmed, and like and that happens, like glyneisha said, in like these very finite principles, like how the pillows are put down, like the ways that things need to happen as you enter into the space. I guess I want to try to think about like what are the ways that we need to be exchanging our art and our energy, and how we will have to divest from all the really bad things like oil and representations that continue to harm us. Like, I think about the example with Tamir Rice's mother in terms of what she called upon activists and also the artist Sean Leonardo, like, divesting from representations of Black death, which are so easily circulated and made by a lot of the time artists of color and reproduced and sold internationally. So like, what are we going to divest from, which includes like divesting from forms of work, like even like making work, like that terminology, and also the kinds of lives we lead. Like, I think we're all going to have to choose that differently. Some people are going to need certain kinds of supports and some people will need other things. But like when we get there, if we imagine it very wildly in the way that June Jordan like was like trying to build out a new Harlem, it's like when we do that imagining, where are we as cultural practitioners and channelers and et cetera, whatever our names and tokens might be, and like, can we build out those kind of practices and name those things in whatever space we show up in currently, And a lot of the time it's naming the fact that that's the world you want to see when you show up inside of the doorstep of a white supremacist institution that creates possibility too, and helps you identify who's there with you. Yeah.
I think we are coming up on time, so I just want to open up to any last minute questions that someone might want to throw in the chat. And in the meantime, do you have any closing thoughts, glyneisha and Jonathan?
Yeah, I think it's so important, like Jonathan said, to end on like, how do we like fit ourselves, the artist, the individual within like this space? And it makes me think about one of those viralist conversations that you shared with me, Lillian, that's about kind of this conversation we're having right now. Y'all can look those up, but a person named Carmen M. Lane, no, it's M. Carmen Lane. They talked about how, before you can decolonize the institution, you have to decolonize the self. And so it's like, we do these things where like we recognize land, but how do we recognize ourselves? How do we recognize how we are fitting and contributing to the systems or against the systems that we're talking about and speaking about, but also even within the work that we're doing. And even if it's like BIPOC spaces only, how do those spaces also contribute to white supremacy? And how can we decolonize the self within that work?
Yeah, I would love to add to that. What reminded me of something I wanted to say earlier that I blanked on is that, and also de-Americanize our narrative about the ways we are, because I think as someone whose family comes from the Caribbean, from Haiti and DR, like I think when we make our visions of how we will do the things we need to do transnational, we figure out that it's not so imaginary, what it would mean to make in ways that really enforce mutual aid, share narratives and story that also honor something sacred and don't just continue to aim to innovate and produce more kinds of products and more kinds of, hoardings of materials and cultures that continue to be about competition, And so if we can think transnationally, then we can ground what we do structurally sometimes. Yeah. And also just thank you. This was really lovely. So it was a pleasure to talk to you, glyneisha and Lily. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for being here. I think I'm not seeing any other questions. And I would like to just end with one thought that it's a quote, but it's sort of in response to what capitalism is, as in what we are working within and how we can respond as cultural workers, whether that's within an institution or outside of it, or wherever you find yourself navigating this. And it's saying that capitalism is organized abandonment. So the only possible response is organized care. To me, that means mutual aid, non-transactional exchange based on a sense of safety, trust, and collective liberation. And I think for me, that is also the sense that I've gotten from what you have shared, is that all these stories of where things have gone awry and where things have felt like this is moving in the right direction can be encapsulated by saying we are trying to work towards care, I think, and that like collective feeling. And so I feel like that is an okay place to end. I just want to thank everyone for being here, and Peter for hosting, helping me host this and setting all this up, and Amplify Arts for always being a lovely home of conversation. So I guess I will end it. I don't know if I end it or Peter ends it, but thank you guys.